We're going to be talking about money. Lots of money. $3.1 billion to be exact. And we'll talk about some other things as well. But let me first introduce my panel. Gentlemen, if you can come up. First is Mr. Peter Durand. Peter is the Vice President of Federal Sector at Acquia. Peter. Next is Mr. Don Hewitt. Don is the Director of Workload and Cloud Solutions Practice at the U.S. Public Sector Division of Hewlett-Packard Enterprises. Mr. Brian Houston. Brian is the CTO of Hitachi Data Systems Federal. And finally, Mr. Bretton Stafford. Bretton, you have a very Star Trek, Star Wars type title. He is the Federation Principal at the Office of the Federation for EMC. So great to have you here today. And I think just to get started here, we heard some, I think, in my opinion, some very big news this morning from Tony Scott and Representative Connolly. And I'm not sure that it will be reflected tomorrow in the headlines you read. I can assure you that if you go to MeriTalk.com, you will see this in the headline. But we heard some really important, I think, information about the status of this $3.1 billion IT modernization fund. There's still a good chance that it will actually become a reality. But there's probably an even chance that it'll never see the light of day. And it's probably an even chance that it won't even make it into legislation. Turns out that what I heard, and maybe some of you have heard, is that Tony Scott may be the key to this. As you recall, if you were here this morning, we launched the Great Scott program to call for Tony Scott to stay on board as the federal CIO through the administration's transition, regardless of who gets elected. Now, I thought it was interesting that he said he hadn't made up his mind yet, but that he has to be asked by somebody. Turns out that the $3.1 billion is his only and best idea at this point, and this is what he said, to fix this legacy IT spending problem. So he may, in fact, be the key to this. And what I'd like to do is start off with our panel, if we could just go down the line and talk a little bit about, would keeping Tony Scott or any federal CIO in position through the administration's transition really make a difference, in your opinion, in making sure that this money actually becomes a reality and we can start working on this problem?
Again, thanks for being here this afternoon, and thanks for sticking around after lunch. I know that's difficult to dedicate the time. So in answer to your specific question, I, of course, think it's helpful to have Tony Scott and other key CIO executives commit to staying through this period of heightened awareness, which we all know is about to start, but also the period of change as we transition between this administration and the next administration. Uncertainty is one of the biggest concerns for industry in our ability to support government. It affects our risk decisions. It affects things like cost. And the indecision that often occurs during that time of transition, especially when there's big RFPs on the street, really creates additional cost, overhead cost, that is otherwise unforeseen. So I believe firmly that if Tony and other significant leaders across the CIO community are in a position to commit to stay through the transition and to keep the programs they're attempting to put in place on track, that would be of great reassurance to industry.
I absolutely agree with you on that. I mean, if you look at the transition that needs to happen, and with this announcement and with this budgetary investment that's being made, without keeping the key personnel in position to be able to drive the transformation that needs to happen, I mean, we would all agree that modernization needs to be pushed forward. I mean, with the adoption of cloud and adoption of all the new technologies, the only way to get there is through modernization. So I would absolutely agree with you that if we have to keep those key personnel in place and in position to make sure that we don't miss any steps along the way and that we keep driving towards the end goal.
Not much of a different comment here with respect to the good reasons around keeping certain leaders in place to actually maintain that driving force around what we have to accomplish. One of the things I think we have to realize as well is that this is not a small initiative. Modernization of the IT infrastructure of the federal government is a major initiative. And at the same time, you can look across any large program as you would any type of large aircraft trying to achieve enough takeoff velocity. You have to have enough runway to achieve that lift in order to make it work. And I think the same thing is here. We have to have enough time to actually have the runway for this program to really be effective and to seat itself within the federal government.
Hi, thanks. Pete Durant here. So I can't disagree. I think a guy like Tony Scott has really creative ideas. I mean, if we heard his talk this morning, we in the federal government today, we still have systems running on 8.5-inch floppy drives. So, clearly there is a need to modernize our infrastructure. And, I think, his vision, what he's trying to, put forth, really, transverses across whatever political party ends up taking over, because, these are all good initiatives I think are going to be very good for our country. And so industry and government really needs to, get behind this.
Let's stay with you for a second, Peter. Let's assume that the $3.1 billion becomes a reality. And I was just talking to someone in the audience earlier who's actually involved in helping the Hill craft some of this language. And when Tony Scott says that we're at a critical turning point, I mean, he means now. It's not this year. But perhaps in the next 30 to 45 days is when they either will or will not have legislation on the street. So let's assume it becomes a reality. How should agencies prioritize this spending? What are the most pressing needs right now for this $3.1 billion?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, all of our federal agencies are in place because they have a mission. So, I think the first thing is really, identifying, what are the most mission critical applications, which ones are providing, services to citizens to, have the biggest impact, for that particular agency. And then it's also, I'd say, figuring out how do you prioritize and rank, which ones of these are the most important, which ones are the low-hanging fruit. Do we look at taking, public-facing websites? Let's get those out of, federal data centers. Let's move those things to the cloud. Let's figure out what's easy. But, I don't think it's going to be an easy question to answer if you do this unilaterally. I agree with Tony. It's, he said there were over 7,000 programs in the federal government. That's a lot. So trying to figure out which items can be, you've got usability and shareability. We started in the government a couple of years ago with email as a service. That looked like a really easy thing, to move to the cloud. So now, how do we find that next set of services, and how do we prioritize and show immediate benefit and ROI?
Don, I think your lab might be working now, so just give it a shot.
Great. Is it working?
I think so.
All right, fantastic. So, so one of the things I think that's very important in the prioritization of how we go about doing this is really, first of all, know what you have in place today. We have a lot of customers we're working with on major contracts today. They're basically going through massive data center consolidations, and they're treating a lot of this consolidation more as a infrastructure type of lift and shift in many cases. I think one of the big drivers that we have to understand is that what do I have in place before I start making these moves, before I start establishing my budget even in some cases. What do I need to move? Where is it going to? What state is my app in? What state does the workload need to exist in after the migration? And really kind of have more of a priority on understanding what's in place today. I think this creates a lot of efficiencies with respect to how I spend that budget, but it also gives a lot of clarity to what I need to achieve through not only an effort of modernization and consolidation, but also efficiency in how I can potentially deliver services going forward.
I would look at it a little bit differently. I mean, if it's infrastructure is one portion of it, but in my eyes, it's the data. It's the data that drives our world, and it's the data that drives the change that needs to be made. The agencies and the organizations within the federal marketplace, we have to understand what data we have and what we can do with the data that we have in place. If you take a step back and look a few years ago, virtualization at a server level was key. I mean, that's really made a big change within the industry. The collapsing of physical servers down to the virtual environment. Now we need to do that at the infrastructure level as well. And while we're doing that virtualization at the infrastructure level at the same time, we truly have to run the analytics and understand what the data is so we can put it in the right place at the right time and make it more appropriate to where it needs to be defined. And when you start looking at it from a holistic view and a virtualization aspect from the top down, and you're starting to run the analytics across the data and understand what the data truly is, now you're really going to be able to understand what your ROI is, what your true return on investment is, and where I can allocate assets or resources or move the data to what needs to be, on-prem, off-prem, so on and so forth. But without understanding what data you have in your environment, I think without having that first step, we're just going to keep going in circles.
So I would just say this in addition to what you've already heard. First of all, I think understanding what you have is critical. Prioritizing what should go where is also critical. That means you have to understand what it is you have and what you'd like to do with it in the future. I say that specifically because oftentimes we have customers who say, I want to replicate the process I have today in a new, more efficient technology, and they think they're going to achieve savings from that. We believe that you got to take a people, process, and technology approach, and that technology is often the easiest part. In other words, if you're examining the migration of things to new optimum hosting environments in order to achieve savings, given all that you've heard from my colleagues, there's a lot of process issues and people issues that are associated with that, which also impact total cost of ownership. Additionally, you have to consider putting the right incentives in place and the metrics in place to understand that you're actually going to save. We've heard previous panelists today talk about the fact that migration to cloud doesn't always deliver savings. And in fact, that's true. So do we have the right business models, total cost of ownership understanding, and then recognition of what we have today and the mission and value it delivers and how it would be different in that alternative future such that savings can be achieved. And the savings might not necessarily be monetary, it might be greater capability offered to the customer of that government agency, right? If you could deliver twice the capability at the same cost, that's savings. But we don't often think in those terms,
So another thing we heard from Tony this morning was that agencies are basically going to have to apply for access to this funding. They're going to have to come up with a detailed business case, how the money would be used, what savings they'll gain from that. But also he mentioned they will evaluate these cases on how much their plans contribute to increasing their security posture. So I'll throw this out to anyone who wants to start us off, but what are the security benefits of pushing this money through to IT modernization? I know it's a broad question, but if we could talk in as specific terms as possible about convincing agencies that there is a security benefit here. Anybody?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'll kick it off a little bit, Eric. So if we look at information security, right, I start looking at what modernization really brings to the table. If I look at across a lot of the vulnerability or a lot of the exploitation reports that we've seen come out from industry over the past few years, a lot of times the data which is being exploited, a lot of the business owners or the data owners themselves didn't even know that data existed, right? I think a lot of what we start looking at with modernization is really, again, it goes back to my last comment, understanding what's there today, bringing that together in a very efficient way by which I can not only manage and efficiently deploy assets within certain platforms and such, but also understand where they're at, track where they're at, have a very homogeneous governance framework that applies to all these different platforms. So modernization to me, actually, and what we see come off with a lot of our customer requests is that they want to understand not only the platforms that they are currently on today, where can they migrate to, but then along with that is, I'm going to use the term hybrid here, but along with that is an understanding of a platform management system that will look over everything, and that encompasses a lot of that modernization objective, but then brings security along with it. If I don't know where my data is, how can I monitor it for any type of exfiltration or anything else along those lines?
So if I may, I think in addition to what Don's describing, we had a large commercial customer that was seeking to transform their IT organization, and in order to do that, they knew they had to achieve higher levels of security and a lower total cost of ownership. Like we've heard all day, they were spending greater than 80% of their IT budget keeping the lights on. So in a services engagement, we helped them understand their as-is environment. They were making lowest price, technically acceptable acquisitions. They had multiple vendors at every layer of their IT stack, and they were doing that to increase competition to drive down cost. At every layer of the IT stack, they had at least 2 versions of the software, current version and N-1, which I know in many in government would aspire to just 2 versions, right? So, and I'm not being critical, I'm being realistic. In some cases, they had 3 or 4 versions of the software, which created great cybersecurity vulnerabilities for them. But they believed that was helping them achieve lowest total cost of ownership. The end result of the engagement, we were able to show them that that level of complexity at every layer of the stack was causing them to manage 6.5 million points of integration. So they were managing all those points of integration instead of developing new capabilities for the organization. So they chose to go to a dual vendor, converged infrastructure stack to push the management of those points of integration onto industry. And that took them down to 330 points of integration to manage instead of IT. So the same number of people in their organization could now deliver much greater capability to that organization, drove costs down, and they became more secure all simultaneously. So it is within the art of the possible with a fund like this to do things, but again, you have to think much more holistically than an individual application or an individual system. Think in terms of standardization, virtualization, modernization, and automation resulting in transformation, a continuum of capability. And think more enterprise-wide, which is what I think you're hearing from my colleagues up here, that you can't just focus on the individual widget. You have to think bigger than that to truly achieve savings.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, if you look at that and through modernization and visualization, so on and so forth, if I could dovetail on a question that was asked on the last panel. I mean, the very last question was asked around encryption. And in today's modernized world, encryption is absolutely there throughout the stack, top to bottom, all the way through. Encrypted data in flight all the way to the cloud, if you're going to go to the cloud, so on and so forth. But in the technologies that are in the data systems today, that is not there. And without modernization, without the virtualization, without being able to go to these newer strategies, you're never going to be able to get that encryption from data at rest all the way through in flight and so on and so forth. But I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it comes down to the virtualization and the understanding the data and knowing where it's going to be going and understanding what steps do I need to take. And it's not just about the widget, it's about understanding the whole infrastructure and the whole enterprise itself.
So, yes, go ahead.
Absolutely. So from a security perspective, modernization, and looking at the cloud, and I'll take it from the vantage point, we operate the world's largest Drupal platform as a service, and at one level, my organization, we'd love everything to go to the cloud, but logically, not everything should go to the cloud, and so where security fits in is agencies, for those really mission critical, sensitive things, that's where they need to be able to focus, and how do we move things that can move out into the cloud, make sense, can be more secure. A couple other thoughts around it. So even if you look at just moving to the cloud, moving public applications, into a cloud environment, the old day, and we still have it today, organizations are, currently hosting web applications on site. Even within DoD, we've got public-facing sites sitting on the NIPRNet, where you've got the public traversing DoD's NIPRNet intranet to get to public-facing content. That in of itself, we don't want necessarily bad guys, traversing their networks. So let's move those things out. I also think it takes a little bit of a, cultural shift from a security perspective, because, we're used to, hey, this is my data center, this is my infrastructure, these are, I know that's my firewall, those are my routers, all my boxes, and now I've moved to this cloud, which, I don't see it, where is it? So from that perspective, it also adds security from obscurity, because the cloud is, it can be multiple data centers, across the world. So it's definitely a journey. It's definitely not a rip and replace environment. I think it's logically figuring out what can we move to the cloud, increase the security posture. Certainly things like FedRAMP are going to be important, and all the way up to the DoD level 5 stack. So
another thing that I'll pick up on from Tony Scott's remarks was that it seems like this process, this habit that we have of taking our eye off the ball is sort of built into the funding process and the funding model, right? We fund each one of these 7,000 programs, and then every year after that it's 20% maintenance to keep it alive. And his argument is that we basically neglect modernization. So how do we go about, if this fund were to become a reality, ensuring that we can make use of this $3.1 billion while not only modernizing the oldest stuff that we're running at each of these agencies, but also not taking our eye off the ball of what's already installed and making sure that they stay up to date? What is the process by which we go about ensuring that?
So first of all, I would say we have to ensure that the right metrics are put in place, right? We talked earlier, or you mentioned that the proposal to access this fund is going to be based on a business case. But if we put the right metrics in place and the right incentives such that an agency can come take advantage of some of this money to modernize, and if they achieve the modernization objectives that they put forth in their business case, how can they use some of the savings that was generated to further that modernization inside of their environment? And again, I think, we often see governmental funds made available in response to activity. I think it's advantageous that this fund is being put together, yes, in response to a significant challenge, but in a proactive way. So how can we help our friends on the Hill create legislation that results in policy that the agencies can take advantage of, and there's incentives for them to not only make use of the money and achieve measured outcomes, but then take advantage of that to snowball effect doing further modernization initiatives.
Anybody else want to tackle that? So we're just going to throw this $3.1 billion at the oldest stuff? Everything's going to work out for the best?
No, I mean, you really have to build a business case. Certainly, inside my organization, going to the CFO shop and saying, hey, we need to modernize this system, that system. You need a business case. I mean, what are the outcomes? Depends on what that mission system, is. Is it going to be better service to, SSA, recipients, better, response time, or is it, cutting costs? But, overall, even if you look at the open source world, how do you take, if you're paying a 20 to 45% tail on maintenance, how do you apply that to functionality and then really show, mission impact back? But I think it's really going to take, you need to put a business case together, that really defines what the key objectives are and strategic outcomes that, are going to occur that you can actually measure.
I look at it this way. I'll take it back to what the data really is. And each agency has their own data that they really own and that they manage and that they maintain. But the cross-collaboration that everybody's trying to come to cross-collaboration within the agencies, and so the data's there. It really comes down to taking that budget and breaking down the data silos that are in place today. Every agency has their own data silos, and even as us vendors, and we were talking about this earlier, is that there's 10 different ways to skin that cat, right? There's 10 different ways to do the exact same thing. And within the agencies, you'll see three ways to do the exact same process and procedure from 3 different vendors on the same floor. And virtualization and data modernization will help alleviate that. But it really comes back to us as the vendors and working more tightly to break down those data silos, to give the agencies access to what they already have in place and really let them grow and give them the future-proofing environments that they need to be able to adapt and modify and go in any direction that the new technologies in the next 3 to 5 years are going to bring. Because we're talking about a problem that's been 5 to 7 years old, but we need to be looking at a problem that's 3 to 5 years out. Because if we fix the problem today with data modernization, by the time the budgets and everything are put in place and the new technologies are on the floor, we need to be able to have the capabilities and the feature sets in place already from the vendors that are up here to be able to modernize and be able to go the next step forward. without having to keep building down these brick and silos.
I think something else, I looked at me earlier and I kind of had a blank stare because I'm like going, how would I address this, I guess, from the perspective of a services type company? And one of the things that we're definitely realizing as we start to work with more customers, one customer we've worked with has a great drive to take the infrastructure they currently have in place today that is underutilized, and how do I take that investment and start to garner certain efficiencies out of that investment, right? One of the large things as well is that there are certain capabilities that are driven through a lot of the hardware and infrastructure currently in place in these agencies today, that with appropriately placed automation, right, things that start to create efficiencies within their own labor force, that will start to gain some of that cost back. And with that cost savings, there's other investments that can be put forth within that savings achievement. I think that at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of, let's say, how do I plan to work within this environment by which I might have this legacy infrastructure leverage for all my traditional workloads, but how do I start to potentially create other types of consumption type services that I can leverage, right? Things that might be cloud, right? It might not be cloud. It might just be virtualization with automation. Let's not get caught up in the words, so to speak. But I think that there's a lot of things that can be created really within even an existing investment that can start to save money and then start to realize how do I better, more efficiently spend my money going forward.
If I may dovetail on that real quickly, Don, Gartner has a report out talking about bimodal IT, which I think reflects the comments you were just making. And I think it's interesting because as industry has responded to this Gartner report, it's created a very divisive set of responses, right? There's a lot of cloud native folks that are like, yeah, you shouldn't do that. You should just jump in with both feet and leave legacy behind. And there are others that I think are more realistic, who are reflecting exactly what Don described. I have this legacy investment and I don't feel like I'm getting the full value out of it. So how do I maximize the value of what I already have and then create a small, net new, hyper automated, capability over here in the same environment, manage it uniformly, right, in one big environment, and start moving capabilities into that and showing the savings so that I could justify further investment in the technologies I require to meet my mission. And I think the Gartner report actually reflects very well the current state of the federal industry. I mean, it's certainly not reflexive of everyone, right? There's always outliers, some that are much more successful and some that are lagging. But I think it's the reality of what this type of modernization pool could really empower, right?
One of the other things we talked about in preparation for the panel was the importance of strategic roadmaps, right? So this goes to this whole issue of what should we migrate to the cloud? What should we allow to just fall by the wayside and replace totally? What should we upgrade and modernize? So what is the role of industry in helping agencies develop these plans? And also, what questions should they be asking industry in terms of devising those strategic roadmaps for the use of these funds?
I think it should. The first question that should be asked is how can you help me understand what I have, and not just from an infrastructure perspective, but from a full holistic environment perspective. It comes down to breaking down the silos. I mean, you take one industry or one infrastructure and you break down the data silos and you give the flexibility and the analytical capability to the data itself. Once you truly understand what you have in your environment, and then you can make more defined and more open decisions around where that data needs to reside. Is it in-house? Is it external? Is it in the cloud? Is it so on and so forth? If you look at where the commercial aspects are and where the commercial industry is at versus the federal marketplace, the difference comes down to is they embraced virtualization 3 to 5 years ago. Not from a server perspective, but from a whole infrastructure perspective. And once they've done that and they've virtualized the environment from a top down, now they've given access and freedom to the data that they can move it to wherever they need to be and run the analytics to understand what it is, no matter if it's OLTP databases or so on and so forth, flat file, CIFS, NFS. The protocol at that point, once you're in a virtualized environment, it really doesn't matter anymore. So you're not going out purchasing a different protocol to support one application. Once they've gone into that virtualized world, now they're able to focus more on the application and the application integration to dive back into the data that they already had and the data that they're producing today. So through that virtualization capabilities that they embraced 3 to 5 years ago, that's really the next step for us. I mean, we look at modernization, it comes through virtualization. It comes through taking the assets that I have, and especially what Don was talking about. Take the assets I have, let's sweat them, let's make sure we understand where the data is, especially when we virtualize and move it to different places. Let's break down those data silos, understand exactly what we have in our infrastructure at the same time, so we make more informed decisions on where we need to go.
Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so from a looking at this whole perspective of how do I modernize, and I look at my particular organization. You've got legacy systems you want to modernize. I like to use the analogy like, how do you keep the wheels on the cart while I'm replacing the engine? How do you keep doing that? So we're seeing this in government today. Agile, iterative processes. I think everything should be agile, even down to what we do for contracting. That's a big piece on, I think adopting cloud, because our contract, the vehicles that are put out, the contracts that are let, really don't allow organizations, if you put a 5-year strategic roadmap, I want to be able to do these 10 mission things, and I let a contract to facilitate those things. But the way technology is evolving so quickly, it could be 6 months, 8 months. All of a sudden these contracts are locked into, it's basically a technology lock that has accidentally occurred. So that's a key piece that needs to be looked at. Also, still driving ROI models. On the commercial side, if you don't modernize, many commercial companies have lots of legacy systems, and we have to be careful on what are we building now? Is this going to be legacy in 5 years? So now start looking at, how do we do use open source technologies, don't get locked in, to those kinds of systems, is really going to be a key piece. And then it's, looking at shared use capabilities, build once, deploy for many. We saw the entire country of Australia, adopted Drupal as an open source platform. So now they were able to leverage that across their entire federal government, and be able to leverage, open models. They're not locked into, any kind of proprietary things. That's a really key piece. But it is a balancing act, because even things, organizations you built 2 years ago, the stuff is obsolete. And how do you still continue to leverage it? I'd say even across the federal government, there's lots of systems that are probably 30 years old, 40 years old. You know what? They actually work. And there's a reason they're still running. And they're providing a valuable use. So how do you really extend the functionality out of those? Because I'm not a believer, you could look at this $3 billion, is this going to be a new IT boondoggle? And, how do we spend all that money, and how does industry go after it? How can we really maximize the investment we have today, extend it, and then find by leveraging the right technologies in front of these applications, give a migration path to the future, and avoid technology lock. That's always going to happen. We know in a couple of years there's going to be something we never even thought about that will change our strategic plans. Typically I've seen a 5-year plan is based on here's today's technology, here's what it's capable of doing. 2 years later, there's a capability that's available. I had no idea we could do this, and that can shift the mission. So I think contracting and that you have to have flexibility in that strategic plan to really adapt as technology adapts, and technology is only an enabler.
Well, you make a really good point before we open it up to questions, but there's different degrees of legacy, right? You say
Right.
30 to 40 years old. The Defense Department, as we learned last week or so, still using 5.25-inch floppy drives for the nuclear arsenal, right? CIO of the Pentagon, Mr. Howelson, was asked about that, and he said there's a reason that we still use those floppy disks, is because they work, they're reliable, and they're secure in the way they're applied in that environment. How do you take, and it doesn't have to be the nuclear arsenal, but how do you take a system like that is so critical to an agency's mission, is that old, and ensure that what you bring in from industry to replace it doesn't break what's been working for 40 years, right?
Can I take that real
Yes.
quick? So I think that's an excellent question. And one of the biggest challenges that I've seen time and time again is that if we have an existing process inside of government, that often the RFP asks to replicate that process. And I understand why, in the case of missile defense, that would probably be the first approach they would take. But imagine, which is fully permitted, as we all know in the acquisition regulations, you tell me what the desired outcome is. I need to modernize my missile defense capabilities. Here's the required capabilities I must have. Here's the SLA and SLO on service. In other words, I can have no disruption in my capability during migration. Give me the desired outcome, the rules of the playing field, the right and left limits, the SLAs and SLOs that you want to achieve, and let me offer you a suggested method of transforming from as is to to be, rather than telling me to create a modern version of what you already own. And so I think fundamentally, we're often hampered by an acquisition process and by an environment where legacy is what we know so well, we can explain to the nth detail, but we don't really have a keen understanding of the art of the possible, which is industry's role, right? Let us help you understand the art of the possible.
Well, I think also to that point, there's a sense that, yeah, I'm all for the art of the possible, but while you're doing that, don't introduce any new vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry?
I said absolutely.
Right.
You can't. You have to be able to adapt and modify and change without bringing any new security holes or glitches or anything else in the environment.
Okay, we've got 6 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to some questions. Was there a hand over here? Yes.
Oh, wait, sorry.
So I actually was hoping that there'd be government people, because you bring up an excellent point, right? So I think industry could probably sit here and cite chapter and verse issues around acquisitions. So I think we've seen all day like thought leaders in the mission area, right? So the why has been answered by government personnel, but I don't know who to ask this to. Maybe you aren't the right people, but is there a similar investment in resources, knowledge base on the acquisition side, right? So we can spend all day explaining why we need to do this, but it breaks down at the moment we get to development of the acquisition. And my contention would be, as an industry member and former government member, if it doesn't manifest itself into a requirement that is evaluated and awarded money, all the other stuff about why we should makes no difference. And so I'm curious to know about the panel's view on this. Maybe that knowledge base doesn't exist within the federal acquisition community today. I'd be curious to know your perspective on that. And is the government, I don't know who can answer this, looking to invest in those types of resources on the acquisition side to ensure that the why translates into the how? Does that make sense? So if we lead with the panel's view on that,
Somebody want to give that a shot?
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things. One, it's organizational alignment. So I think that's a key piece. The business drivers and procurement need to be lockstep, in line with, hey, what are we trying to achieve as a mission? That's certainly not an easy thing, to accomplish. So I think, that's certainly a key piece to this.
So what I would add is, first of all, we had a very similar discussion in the speaker's room before we came out and on a phone call a couple weeks ago. We're equally as frustrated, okay? There's a couple of pieces to this that cause my frustration, and so hopefully I can just voice those unemotionally and then provide you some thoughts, right?
Emotion is okay too.
First of all, I would say what we hear leadership say they want is not what is coming out in the RFPs that they're seeking to acquire. Huge delta, okay? Huge delta. We all know it. So let's help them understand how to close that gap, right? And that gets to the point I was making a moment ago. The acquisition process allows them to state requirements and outcomes, SLAs and SLOs, and shouldn't care the underlying technology that delivers them as long as the contractor can deliver. But they often choose not to go that path, although that's a possibility. They often tell us what to buy, how to buy it, how to integrate it, how to deliver the service, map to the PWS, And unfortunately, that's buying new what they're doing today instead of how can I achieve the same outcomes in a different way to save money, right?
So, sorry, to that point, since we don't have government on the state, for what it's worth, I think it may be interesting to raise that as a topic, right? So I don't know either. I don't know the answer, but it is not translating into the actual acquisitions that we spend cycles bidding against. So what are they doing to ensure that everybody's in lockstep, right? My experience has always been, I know what I want, I communicate that to the acquisitioner, the buyer, and then I'm gone. So for what it's worth, I think that would be an interesting thing to pull the thread on for all of us. I think everybody, industry and government, for what it's worth.
Totally agree. Two quick follow-ups, right? Literally today, communicated the same thing to one of the former panelists, right? And the answer was, if I actually tell you what I want in the RFP, it won't make it through the acquisition process. It has to be watered down to the lowest common denominator so we can create fair competition. I would argue that's a fundamental disconnect in the acquisition community and in the contract legal community. It's a misunderstanding and a lack of real knowledge about the art of the possible. And I think we got to do both, right? If you think in terms of acquisition, the buying entity or the mission owner is often largely disaggregated from the acquisition person, and the engineering team that may put the solution together over here may have no real understanding of actual mission outcome. So there's much we can do to be the glue that talks to both sides and communicates that. While there are restrictions on our ability to speak to the acquisition side, we've got to constantly influence and educate them as well. There are tenders on the street today for DoD projects that indicate your RFP has to have a plan on how you're going to get FedRAMP certified and achieve the DoD security requirements we heard about earlier. And it originally stipulated in the DoD Cloud Security Requirements Guide that the contracting officer would determine whether that plan was viable or not. And if it wasn't viable, you'd no longer be considered. We all in this room know that that person is the last person in the world that should make that determination, right? So there's a lot that we can do to help them understand where the difficulty is in the process so they can fix it.
Got time for one more quick question.
Well, in kind of answer to that, I'd say that it's the project manager's responsibility of creating a statement of work and identifying the vehicles that in the vehicles themselves, they can actually, I don't want to say restrict, but filter some of what you're looking for. So you can look for vehicles that are more pertinent to IT acquisition as opposed to office supplies. And so that should assist in narrowing down. And I know that the GSA 18F is one of those vehicles that they're utilizing in trying to identify specific types. And Eagle 2 is another one where you can specify the type of acquisition that you're trying to undertake. And then through that, the SOW or SU can be written as such to allow industry to incorporate their own ideas, focusing on the end objective as opposed to nickel and diming and identifying exactly, micromanaging how you want it accomplished. Does that answer your question better?
It does. My contention would be the mission owner. I understand there's different roles, but the mission owner has to be involved in every single aspect of the acquisition, even though they're not an acquisition.
Absolutely.
And the acquisitioner works for the mission owner. So it seems siloed. It's my experience, it's always been siloed, and it shouldn't be if we're going to do this transformative stuff. The world according to me, right? And one guy. But I just think it'd be interesting to.
Well, thank you very much. A really great point, great discussion. I want to thank my panel.